This week, the White House hosts leaders from 49 African countries to try and convince them that their continent is a real priority for America. It's going to be a hard sell, since many Africans feel that Washington has treated them with a lot of benign neglect, more of a problem than an opportunity. A place that's full of precious minerals that we want, like lithium and cobalt, which America needs for its electric cars. While Russia's kind of zoomed to the top as Africa's #1 weapons dealer, and China's trade with African countries has reached a record $261 billion last year. That's about 5 times more than the U.S. An African youth survey by Ichikovitz Family Foundation found that 77% of youth across the continent identified China as the most important nation for Africa's future, not the United States. Plus, China deals with whatever government is in place, no questions asked, while the U.S. cherry-picks its allies and offers lectures about democracy. So can the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit here in Washington, D.C. turn things around? And what can America offer that Africa really wants? Today, we're talking with Arikana Chihombori Quao, the former ambassador of the African Union to the United States. She's also the founder of the Africa Diaspora Development Initiative, which aims to link Africans abroad back to the continent. Ambassador, it's such a pleasure to talk with you today. This big summit is going on right now in Washington, D.C. You're in Zimbabwe. I guess I want to start by asking you, what do the leaders of Africa and President Biden have to get right after this week that you think is essential?
Thank you for having me. This is a very important summit. It's a conversation between the continent and the United States, a conversation that is desperately needed, particularly at this time in our history and in our life. The United States, let me start by saying, it still remains the most preferred trading partner for the African nations. However, like I used to tell the State Department and any engagements that we've had with the United States, I felt during my tenure that the United States was slowly losing ground, and they were risking losing their position as Africa's preferred trading partner. So this is a very important meeting that I hope that if the United States, like I used to tell my colleagues, I felt that the United States, if this was a basketball game, the United States needed to call for timeout. For U.S. needed to realize that this is a new game and it required new rules of engagement. Therefore, a need for the United States to re-strategize. I'm hoping that for a change, this meeting, the United States can begin to realize it's no longer business as usual. It's no longer a case of the United States saying, we make policy and we tell the Africans. That has got to change. It is a recipe for disaster. It is a recipe for the United States seeing itself losing its place as Africa's preferred trading partner. That's what makes this meeting very important. And I'm hoping that the US can call for timeout and understand that engaging Africa at this time, it is a new game that is calling for new rules of engagement. And therefore, it is time to re-strategize and treat the Africans fairly, treat the Africans respectfully, and treat the Africans as equal partners.
You know, Ambassador, I think one of the things that I'm trying to be sensitive to is that we often over in the United States, as you know, and you were the ambassador of the African Union, tend to talk about a continent as opposed to individual countries and nations, of which there are 54. There are 49 heads of state here in Washington this week. And are we making a mistake? Is our ignorance on our side, from your impression of our ignorance, you know, amplified by us talking about Africa so much as opposed to talking about Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Ghana? Should we be, is our illiteracy in this level so obvious that it's a real problem? And do these kinds of summits that bring everyone together do a disservice to that kind of getting to know each country more distinctly?
I think for the United States, and I'll repeat it, and I used to repeat it all the time during my tenure, what really is behind the failure of effective engagement with Africa is the disrespect of the Africans. That's where the problem begins. If we cannot accept, if the United States cannot accept Africans as equal partners, If the United States, for example, let's look at this particular meeting, this particular summit. There was no defined agenda. There has never been defined agendas whenever they meet with African countries as individual countries. It's always the United States setting the agenda, the United States setting the policies, and the United States telling the Africans about the policies. That is no way to have any meaningful engagement. If you take, for example, the FOCAC meeting that was held between China and the African heads of state, way in advance, the issues were clearly defined. The agenda was going to focus on trade. It was going to focus on aid. It was going to focus on investments. The African heads of states were engaged in the discussion, in the planning. The outcomes were clearly defined with a way forward in terms of follow-up. It was a fruitful meeting that addressed the issues that needed to be addressed between not only African countries individually with China, but also Africans collectively with China. There is no published agenda. There are no issues that have been presented to the African heads of states. Africans have not been asked to engage in terms of creating the agenda and making sure that when the African heads of states come to Washington, the outcomes, the issues to be discussed are going to be meaningful outcomes with follow-up and deliverables that are going to be beneficial to both. It remains a one-sided conversation with the United States telling the Africans the agendas and the policies. The Africans are not on the table to discuss issues pertaining to us, wherein lies the problem. And the reason that continues to be the case, what underscores that is the disrespect for Africans. I repeated it, I complained about it repeatedly. It is a serious problem. The United States must understand that Africans are not going to take it anymore. If you don't treat the Africans fairly, the United States is going to see itself slowly losing ground to China, to Russia, to all other nations, because without respecting the Africans, without treating the Africans as equal, without understanding that exploitation and abuse of Africa simply cannot continue, this meeting, this summit, is going to be yet another gathering with no outcomes, no deliverables until the next summit. I'm sorry, but the disrespect of the Africans is at the bottom of it all. Agenda for this meeting should have been set out in advance. Africans should have been involved. Without the involvement of the Africans in these discussions, this is a useless meeting. I'm sorry, but that is the fact.
No, I am very grateful for your candor. And it sounds to be, I mean, I think there was a lot of criticism of the last summit like this under President Obama, that there was like no follow through. And, you know, it's one of the big questions I'm asking is, how do you make a big bang summit where everyone comes over? It's like checking off the box and say, okay, we've done Africa, now we can move on to other things. How do you make that something that's a more sustainable and a more continuous engagement of the United States with Africa? And what I'm hearing from you is, frankly, a lot of disappointment and you know, a lot of pessimism about what may come out of this summit.
Well, the point of the matter is already, you know, nothing is going to come out of it because it is a one-sided conversation.
Right.
Where is the agenda? The agenda should have been published way in advance. The African leaders should have been given an opportunity to also state their position so they can come up with an African position that can then be discussed alongside the American position. So the fact that it is a one-sided conversation, that is yet going to be another useless meeting with no outcomes. But again, I'm going to keep emphasizing the reason this is happening is because there is a disrespect for the Africans. There is a general feeling that we don't need to hear from the Africans. Their opinions do not matter. That wherein lies the problem. Why were the Africans not consulted? Why were the Africans not part of an agenda? Why was there not even an agenda like what happened during the FOCAC meeting with China? Those are some basic issues. No head of state. President Biden would not pick up and go to meet with any other leader in the world without an agenda. That simply doesn't happen.
Right.
So what makes the U.S. think that they can engage African leaders without an agenda? Bye.